Welcome to this week's episode of Liberty Chat, brought to you by the Liberal Democrats.
Good evening, everybody. I am Kate Fantinel. I am your host this evening. I am also your lead Senate candidate for Western Australia, so you get double your money tonight. I am joined by my fellow lead candidates, Campbell Newman in Queensland, John Ruddick in New South Wales, and of course, the official opposition leader in Victoria, David Limbrick. We've got a massive show tonight. We have a big discussion about the budget, one of the most terrible budgets I've seen, and I know my fellow Senate candidates feel the same. We then are introducing you to our ACT lead Senate candidate. It announced our Tassie candidate, Topher Field, today. Big news for the Lib Dems. He will be on the show next week. We also have two fantastic New South Wales House of Representative candidates joining us as well. We also have our final Freedom Manifesto video, so a big show for you tonight. But first, let's go to our lead Senate candidates and see what they've been up to. Campbell Newman, can I start with you?
G'day everyone, g'day Kate. Look, over the last week and a half, I suppose I've had a regional tour to the southwest of Queensland. So we visited the west and southwest, going to places like Goondiwindi, St George, Charleville, Dalby and Roma, meeting mayors, councillors, chambers of commerce and local business people. And that's been very, very useful in terms of to pull together what the big issues are out there. Number one, it's telecommunications, black spots and the like. And number two, it's not being able to get skilled and even unskilled workers. There's basically zero unemployment out there. And even if you can get people, you can't accommodate them. We also went to the Toowoomba show on the weekend just past. Spent 2 days there, met a lot of people, shook a lot of hands. Toowoomba's got COVID going around it. I reckon if I don't get COVID the next 48 hours, I'm not going to get it at all. But so far, feeling fine. It was interesting because we were in close proximity to the Greens, the Liberal National Party and the ALP. We did get a much stronger level of engagement. In fact, they really had very little engagement. We also made a big announcement while there about the Inland Rail project, which I won't go into the details of, but we put out a media release on that. And it's a very important announcement for us right across southeast Queensland, for our candidates, for Michelle Jakes, for Toby in the seat of Ford, for even for Steve Murphy up at Rockhampton and Capricornia. I won't go into the details, but it's an announcement that brings together a range of things about Inland Rail and is quite an effective campaigning policy position. And it's in line with our values because it's Inland Rail is a project that's funded, but we're saying this is how you save money and spend the money that is being allocated far more wisely.
What about you, JR? What's happening in New South Wales? I know you've got your launch next weekend that I'm coming across for.
Fabulous, thank you. Well, it's the 9th of April, so not this Saturday, but the next Saturday. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right in the heart of the city. We've got Mr. Limbrick joining us, which we're very grateful that he's coming up because we know he's busy. But David, you are very popular in New South Wales, so we're pleased that you could make the effort. Look, we've also got an event tomorrow out at Parramatta. So Liza Tazewell will be there, who we're going to meet later on. It's for Nick Samios, who is our candidate for Barara. I was with Nick on the weekend at Hornsby, which is sort of northwest Sydney, which is people consider it the Bible Belt of Sydney, and it sort of votes very solidly for the Liberal Party. And me and Nick were there and a few other good people. Yeah, we had quite a few good conversations. But look, I have to be honest, this is late. It has been months since we have been forced to wear a mask in shopping centres. And I thought that there would be a lot of common sense there. I really reckon 6 to 7 out of 10 people were walking around with a mask. Okay, so, this is Philip Ruddick's old seat. Okay, so I was quite disappointed with that. I thought there was more common sense. I know people do that in the leafy suburbs, but anyway, the next day I had more. I went out to with Cameron Shantz for that, who's our candidate out at the federal seat of Chifley, and that is the heart of the western suburbs. This is southwest Sydney. We went to the Assyrian National Day. These are not to be the little Christian minority community, fabulous people. And, we had a very warm welcome out there. And, talking about the budget, which I know John Humphreys is going to talk about in a moment, Chris Bowen turns up to talk because he's like the local member or something. There's about 2,000 or 3,000 people there. Chris Bowen gets up there and just brazenly says, if a Labor government's elected, we're going to give the Assyrian community $500,000. And I just thought, you think the people are that dumb? This is one of the most locked down parts in the world. And look, he barely got a clap for it. $500,000, these people. Anyway, that's my report. Wollongong on the weekend as well. I think I'm going to Wollongong on Saturday. So hopefully we're going to meet a few good people down there.
You have a very busy calendar, JR. Now moving to David Limbrick in Victoria. What have you been doing? I know you've been in isolation, so maybe not as busy as the rest of us.
Well, I have been in isolation. Many of my family members have been sick in the last week, but somehow I've miraculously appeared to be immune. So I said to my team, it's probably a combination of the vaccine plus shaking hands with thousands of vaccine refusers has supercharged my immune system or something. But I don't know. But I don't seem to be able to get it at this point. So that's good news. But I did still participate. I was meant to go to an event in person in Mortlake last Saturday, but by one of our candidates out there, Amanda Mead. But I went virtually instead, and that was really great. I gave a speech via Zoom, which isn't ideal, but it was better than nothing, I suppose. And from all reports, it sounded like it was a really great event. I've also been on television over the last week. I'm out of isolation as of today. So next weekend, I've got a big weekend plan. I'm going to Geelong and also Point Cook for two events there on Saturday and Sunday. And also something that's not specifically related to the campaign, but is big news. Many of you that have been following me will know that we had a successful motion in Parliament from the Liberal Democrats about getting something referred around vaccine mandates to the IPMAC, the Independent Advisory Committee. We got a response from them today, the same day that I put out a media release slamming them. So that was timely. So we'll see what happens with that soon, but it's, if you want to see the details of that, I've posted it all on Twitter and you can have a read of what they responded with. But they are going to look at mandates, so we'll at least give them consideration, whatever that means. But so it's looking like things are moving there, which is great.
Speaking of mandates, there are a lot of people in the chat asking about South Australia who dropped some of their mandates on education professionals today. South Australian election was a few weeks ago. I was there in my birth state. I know JR was born there too. And at the moment, we're still in the mix for the last Legislative Council seats. So they're still counting. They're at about 88% of the count at the moment, and then preferences come after that. So we might not know this week, but hopefully next week we're still in the mix. So James Hull has been working really hard in South Australia with Campbell, our Senate candidate, and we'll definitely bring you an update as soon as we know the result. Now, moving on, the budget. I know many of you last night probably tuned in like I did to watch what kind of money was going to be splashed around. Campbell Newman was on Sky News commentating. JR did a fantastic live stream, and I know David Limbrick was watching it too. We are blessed to have as our president one of the experts that comments on the budget and the founder of our party, Dr. John Humphreys, who's joining us tonight. He's back from the Netherlands. He's a little bit jet lagged, but he is indulging us with his views on the budget. Welcome to the show, John.
G'day, Kate. G'day, gents. Good to be back. Good to be back down under.
Welcome back, mate.
Good to see you, Mr. President.
Yep,
it's great to have you back. You came in the best time when the budget was handed down. Can you just give us an overview on your thoughts on the budget?
Yeah, sure. The first thing that occurred to me going through the budget papers, mostly today, not last night, given I landed at 8 p.m. But the first thing that occurred is that my summary of this budget is very similar to my summary from last year. This was Campbell said it quite well last night. This was a massive lost opportunity. The parameter improvements, so the improvement in the economy improved, and that's great news. But that naturally would have improved the budget bottom line by 190 billion by itself. If the government had just done nothing, that would have happened. But the government didn't do nothing. They didn't bank those gains, as Josh Frydenberg has been saying all day in the media. What they did is they spent half of it.
Yeah.
They banked the other half. Sure, that's nice. But all they had to do was basically sit still and they could have significantly cut the deficits. This size in the electoral cycle, at this place in the electoral cycle, we should not be having such large deficits. The government could have, they announced a deficit for the coming year of about 80. It was 78 billion, but I know we're speaking quickly here to make these numbers a bit easier for people to remember. About 80 billion deficit, which is a massive deficit, far bigger than it should be. If the government had instead not done all their other spending, simply sat still, but given us the fuel tax cut and made it permanent, we could have had a deficit of only 59 or about 60. Right? So we would have had a deficit from 80 down to 60 with a permanent fuel tax cut. And all we had to do to get there was the government had to stop spending our money. This doesn't even involve slashing and cutting and burning. They simply had to just withhold their urge to just splurge every time a budget comes around. So that's a massive lost opportunity in letting the budget improve, a massive lost opportunity in making that fuel tax cut permanent. I mean, it's good that they cut it. That's better than nothing. I suppose, credit where it's due. It's better to have some tax cut than no tax cut. But once again, they've missed a great opportunity to make that permanent. And it is affordable. And you could have a lower deficit while still making that fuel tax cut permanent. And then you got to look at the way the government has deteriorated the budget. They talk about their tax cuts. The tax cuts are small and temporary. Their spending increases are large and permanent. So the long run legacy of these budgets, year after year of the Liberal Party, is they announce a little tax cut, that they take it away again. But they keep pumping out more spending every year so that the way they plan on eventually balancing the budget sometime in 10 or 20 years, if they ever get there, is going to be through taxes catching up. They're not actually going to cut spending to balance the budget as they should. So looking at that, by the way, something to keep in mind, every year, there is an automatic roughly $10 billion tax increase every year from bracket creep. So bracket creep is just the natural state of affairs where inflation pushes you into a higher tax bracket and you pay more income tax as a percentage of your income year on year. But the government gets away with a $10 billion tax increase every year. So every year the government is not giving a $10 billion tax cut. They are subtly and sneakily increasing your taxes without you knowing. And this tax cut is, as you know, it's better than nothing, but it is not $10 billion. So they're not even actually cutting taxes. They're giving us back a little bit of the bracket creep, but not enough. And then even the tax cut is temporary. So massive lost opportunity. And even the money they gave away in the wrong way. So that's roughly the summary. Happy to go into more.
So John, it was a missed opportunity, and I started my thing last night on Sky by saying it was a budget I thought, and I really mean it, that the Labor Party would have been happy to hand down. But just wanted to ask you some of the things the projections they had, and I mean the big issue at the moment, the big issue is inflation. What do you think about an inflation forecast for next year, 4.25? I myself said 6. I would have loved to have said 8 or 9 because I really think that it's got legs, but I didn't want to sound like a total maniac. What do you think is going to happen there on inflation?
Curiously, the budget half agrees with you. So the GDP deflator is another measure of inflation, and that says 6.5 for next year. So the CPI is the one they report. I mean, this gets very esoteric, and so people tune out quite quickly, but you really shouldn't. The CPI, the way they normally measure inflation, doesn't factor in higher costs of where you're living. Your accommodation costs, your rents, not included in the CPI. So if you want to create artificially low CPI, just carve out a bunch of things that are going up in price. Very cheeky by the government, and that shows up in the fact that the GDP deflator is much higher. So look, I'm not going to make a prediction because if you get it right, you get no love, and when you get it wrong, everyone points at you. So I don't know. I got to say one thing about inflation though is, to a large degree, it's still within our control. Smart decisions by the government can get the inflation genie back in the bottle. So this is a controllable problem if we have a government that's willing to make difficult and responsible decisions. Now that last bit is crucial, and I got to say, looking at this government and quite frankly the opposition, it seems that we have a shortage of politicians who want to make difficult, responsible decisions, and hence the urgent need for the wonderful candidates we have in this room to get elected. But it's not easy to make tough decisions and to tell people that sometimes they can't get free trinkets. But if we want to actually control these big problems for the future, the debt and the inflation, there's going to have to be some harder decision making.
JR, what were your thoughts?
Well, look, you know what? In 2016, when Turnbull was the Prime Minister, I don't know. It was actually Abbott's second budget. So that would have been about 2015. Anthony Albanese said, and it was all through the paper at the time, and he was like, middle ranking in the shadow minister at the time. So this is way before COVID, obviously. Okay, this is like 7-8 years ago. Anthony Albanese told the Sydney Morning Herald, Ross Gittins, he says, this is a fabulous budget. This is a pro-Labor budget. All this spending, all these tax rises, we think this is great. He said the Labor Party would be proud of this. Now, that was way before any of this COVID crap. The only time that this government, which is an 8-year government, feels very like an old government, it's only 8 years, at the very beginning, in Tony Abbott's first budget, he had this very dysfunctional attempt to rein in the debt. Now, the debt at that time, the debt that Rudd handed over to Abbott was, I think, about 258 billion. So, and remember, Hockey and Abbott would go on in opposition, would go around saying all the time, "Oh, the debt's out of control. The debt's out of control. Vote for the sane fiscal, the adults in the room about the economy. Vote us back in." So Abbott comes in, and he did attempt to do some spending, okay, and he said that people have got to pay $7 to go and see the doctor. Oh, boo-hoo! People can't afford $7 to go and see the doctor, okay. But then in the same budget, and he got a lot of criticism for that budget. In the same budget, he came out with all these crazy spending ideas. The world's highest paid parental leave. He put aside $20 billion for some garbage government-funded medical research centre. Okay, so even that's their best budget. So this government, after 8 years, has that's what it's just got worse and worse every year.
David?
Look, I mean, it's hard to believe that the same party running this country is the same party that, less than a couple of decades ago proudly announced that they paid off the mortgage, right? Like they had a net debt of zero, right? And
back in the black.
Back in black and all that. And it was just, it seems crazy to me that we're not confronting this big moral issue, which I've talked about a lot in Victoria on the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee. The idea of this intergenerational, I see it as intergenerational theft, what we're doing. We're spending all this money now and taking it from our children and grandchildren. Like, they're the ones that are going to have to pay for all this. And I'm really concerned about not just the idea of, what's the moral question here with doing that, but also we've got, we're in a global environment where we have to think about international security interests, right? And how much debt are we going to be into, and who are we going to be in debt to, right? This is a big problem. Like when I asked about this in Victoria, when they were issuing bonds like crazy, they were saying, well, we've got 17% of our bonds are issued to foreign investors. And my question to them was, well, which countries own this debt, right? They didn't know the answer because it was all done through platforms and stuff. They didn't actually know which countries are doing it. I don't know if there's better visibility or transparency on that at a national level, but it's clearly a problem at the moment, as Russia has found out to their detriment, because they've done something that people don't like, and markets have frozen them out, and it's a big problem being in a lot of debt. You make yourself really weak and vulnerable. So I think there's a lot of moral and security issues here. We have to, rein this in and at least have a plan for getting back to, paying off the mortgage again, I suppose.
The debt issue is such a good one to show the difference between long-term and short-term thinking. Because when your debt is relatively manageable, which it has been for the last couple of decades in Australia, it is the easiest thing in the world to take the short-run sugar hit, borrow a bit more, sprinkle it around, especially if there's an election coming. The costs are long-run costs. The costs are taking another step in the wrong direction towards a potentially calamitous outcome if you keep walking that way. But because that is a long-run pain for potentially a short-run political gain, you see a lack of political courage, a lack of political leadership, leading people to take that short-run sugar hit. I think you correctly point out that a couple of decades ago, there was such a thing left as political leadership in this country from both sides of the aisle. There was some good reforms done in the 80s and 90s from both sides of the aisle. And it seems like a distant memory now. It seems like something you only read in history books. The idea of political leadership coming from the major parties this day it seems almost laughable. So it's a sad indictment of the trend of politics. Cam,
John,
sorry.
can I ask, where do we stand if we compare Australia's budget position, the debt position, versus the OECD? Where do we fit? And I understand America's probably in the worst position.
You talking about debt, John?
I'm talking about debt and deficit.
Debt. I can wave this around. You probably won't. People wouldn't be able to see it, but from the Australian, and that basically, the Australian is essentially saying, well, Australia's sort of below 50% gross debt to as a percentage of GDP, and then compares us to Germany, Canada, Britain, France, US, Italy, Japan. Isn't Australia good? Is the I totally reject that. I mean, there's basically a lack of leadership across those Western democracies as well, in the way that John was saying.
Yeah, so to answer that directly, our debt levels are, as a percentage of GDP, a bit lower than OECD average. Our current position, I said this last year as well, and I've been saying this for a while, our debt position now, if you could freeze it, if you could introduce responsible political leadership sometime in the near future, is entirely manageable. This problem is a very fixable problem. The problem isn't really the debt level, it's the debt trajectory. So our current level is manageable, but the current level is getting worse every year. And then you've got to say, all right, well, it'll become manageable and we'll get political leadership in the future and we'll manage it then. But I worry, I look at the politics right now and where is that political leadership?
Can I just interject, John, because I think that this is about the trajectory. It's the issue. It's almost the sort of cultural, philosophical, it's the vibe sort of thing that this budget is actually engendering to Australia right now. It's saying government will shower money on you. The government will always pick up the pieces. The government will always pay the bills. The government's got so much money, it will just keep spending and spending. It is a welfare budget. I mean, we're now spending on social security. We're bringing in around $548 billion in tax in total receipts, and yet 221 billion goes on social security and welfare alone. It's just NDIS is like a runaway train because Gillard rushed the implementation of it. I got into a bit of strife with the media when I was Premier because I was saying, hey, whoa, let's sort this out, get this properly defined before we actually launch. No, but Gillard used it as a political bulldozer. If you weren't for the NDIS, you were a mean, nasty, mean-spirited person. But the result of that now is it is just doing this because people are now getting access to NDIS who never, when it was first contemplated, would have actually got access to it. How do you define disability? If you didn't define it properly at the beginning, then you now have this bottomless pit. So someone with, a problem that we would never have contemplated getting support now is going to get it. And they just don't have that. No one's got the courage on this one, of course, political will to deal with this one because it's such a big hot potato. So that's what bothers me about it, John. It's like, that's why there isn't the political will. It's because it's these sort of welfare type issues that are in the Australian psyche. We've actually encouraged people to think this way. And the last 2 years have really been dangerous in terms of what they did with things like JobKeeper.
Yeah, a quick comment on the size of the SS&W, the social security and welfare function in the budget. It is large and growing, Cam, as you rightly point out. A thing that some people can miss about that is a very large percentage, something in the order of 30 to 40% of that money is churn. So that is tax paid by a family or tax paid by a person, given over to a bureaucrat. They pass it around to 3 other bureaucrats. They all take their cut and then they give it back to the same person. So, I mean, there is massive scope for large middle-class tax cuts linked to middle-class welfare cuts so that the government just plays a lesser role in your life. You keep more of your money, you get fewer trinkets, you're a more independent human. You can do that without, our policy, indeed. You can do that without actually hurting anyone. So that's one thing to note. A second thing to note, going to, you and I, as usual, are in furious agreement on this. The problem with the debt is the trajectory. And one thing I note about this is you go back 10 or 20 years, there used to be a constituency out there that really wanted to vote for surpluses. A deficit was a bad thing, and politicians used to go to the election trying to hide their deficits or trying to argue they didn't have deficits because they were worried that they were going to be punished at the ballot box. And one of my fears for Australia right now is both sides of politics seem to have drawn the conclusion that politically deficits don't matter. They can get away with it. I mean, this is an $80 billion deficit, $80,000 million deficit coming from a supposedly liberal government. And they just think they can get away with that. And it's not like Labor's going to do any better. This seems to have, we've lost this space where the voting public punished deficits and rewarded surpluses. And this is why I worry about the trajectory. I mean, this hope that we'll fix it someday.
That's it, John.
Where is this political leadership going to come from, if not from the wonderful people sharing this room with me right now?
The trajectory is like the problem here. And it's not just trajectory on a financial level. It's also trajectory on a, on a freedom level. And I think this is exactly why we need Liberal Democrats, people elected to the Senate, is you need someone that's going to provide a voice in Parliament that's going to say, hang on a minute, maybe we should be doing this, right? And maybe we shouldn't be spending that much. Maybe we shouldn't get into that much debt. And we've seen when we've had our people elected in various parliaments, both in federally and in states, it's changed the conversation in some ways, because what it means is that no longer can the Liberal Party get up and basically just come out with this sort of socialist budgets and get no criticism from Parliament, and they'll get it from us. Like we'll say, well, what are you doing? Like what's your long-term plan here to get out of debt? This is exactly why we're needed, I think.
Putting my lead Senate candidate hat on for a second, I am genuinely concerned about the debt for my generation, being the youngest of the candidates. When I talk to people my age, they don't even understand that the JobKeeper thing was your taxes that you are going to have to pay for in the future. They just didn't get it. So there's obviously a message that we need to get out there, a bit of an education campaign, if you will, about how it actually all works. I was fortunate enough to work for former Senator David Leyonhjelm and with former Senator Duncan Spender, who authored the alternative budget, which I know a lot of you are asking about in the chat. And that was just a fantastic document that was produced every year. This kind of budget, big spending documents came out. We had a solution on the table. We're not just coming up saying, no, no, no. We had our own budget formalised and costed. So the Liberal Democrats, we have a debt and deficit policy in the Freedom Manifesto that Campbell, Newman and John referred to before. So I encourage you to read it and educate yourself about these kind of things, because it's so important. And if it's not your generation, it's my generation, or it's your children's generation. So it's really important for us to be politically engaged, especially at this time. Any final comments before we move on?
I did just want to reiterate something. I mentioned it in passing earlier, but as a party, we are very strong advocates for tax cuts and are very strong advocates for responsible budgeting and getting debt under control. And people who assume that increased government spending is a way of life sometimes get confused by that. They think the only way to shrink the deficit is to increase tax. But as I just mentioned here, the fuel tax cuts that have been announced are temporary. They're 6 months. They shouldn't be, they should be permanent. We are overtaxed as it is. The fuel taxes are way too high. They are a regressive tax. They hit average people harder than wealthy people. And it is good policy to get rid of it. It's just a shame they didn't get rid of it permanently. But here's the thing I looked at going through the numbers here. You could make the fuel tax cuts permanent, as the Lib Dems have been arguing for, make them permanent. And as long as you just don't spend extra money, you still have lower deficits. So this is here, it's a proof positive of the example that we want to give. Have lower deficits, pay down the debt quicker, but you can also, if you do it responsibly, you can afford good tax cuts that improve the quality of the economy.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us today. Welcome back to Australia. We can't wait to campaign with you. Busy few weeks. So glad to have you back. And thank you for joining us. Please stay in the chat because there's lots of questions in there. If you could spare some time, that would be great.
Can I just put John Humphreys on the spot? I think John, if you're there, you're coming to Sydney, is that right?
Yes.
On the 9th of April for the launch. Are we locking you in here? You've been sort of sounding like you're 90% here.
This is called an ambush, JR.
It is an ambush, yes.
Yes, you've roped me in. As long as you have a spare couch, then...
Yes, deal.
The president sleeping on the couch of the lead Senate candidate in New South Wales. That's what we're a family, the Lib Dems. That's what I love about our party. Now, speaking of our family, we have grown today. We have released our new Senate candidate for Tasmania, Topher Field. As I mentioned at the start, he will be joining us next week. But tonight, we can introduce you to the lead Senate candidate for the ACT. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Guy Jakeman. Thank you for joining us, Guy.
Hey, nice to meet you. Nice to be here.
Magic Guy.
Fantastic. So, Guy, can you just tell us a little bit about why you put your hand up to run as the lead Senate candidate in the ACT?
So I suppose a long history, I guess. So, well, first off the bat, I was one of the first signatories, like the first 100 people signed up to the LDP back in 2001, was it? Yeah, 21 years ago. So I've been there just after John started the party. So, and essentially it's civic duty, I guess, is the main reason. So I've been
a true Canberrian.
Well, it's not just me. It's like a lot of people I know around Canberra. So I've always appreciated when I actually have someone to vote for, rather than having the reverse order of I want this person last, and then having to work backwards to go, oh, and this one becomes number one just because there's no one left. So actually having a number one to start with, which is someone who actually stands for human rights, good economic policy, small government, just Liberal Democrats, basically. So when I've had a Liberal Democrat running in my electorate, it's been really nice. And so hence, it's basically part of my civic duty, and this time I can vote for myself. So I think I have someone to vote for this time. And we've got a number two as well, so that's all good. So that's the main reason. And then the second reason, I guess, is repeal of the Andrews Bill, so which is basically giving ACT territory rights. So if people don't know, it's a clause that got introduced during the Howard era to basically overturn ACT experimenting with things like euthanasia, gay marriage, and legalizing recreational drugs, that sort of thing. So it basically was a deliberate insertion to stop the ACT experimenting on these sort of social policies and social freedoms. And Zed Seselja, our current candidate, he outright says, no, ACT should not have the ability to choose for itself. So he does not stand for basically sovereignty of this territory.
Fascinating. So, John Ruddick, will you be helping the ACT campaign, being as you're so close neighbours?
Yes, absolutely. Guy, I'm more than happy to come down because it's only about a 2-hour drive, 3-hour drive to get down to Canberra. So let us know what we can do. And I have always been surprised that in Canberra, the capital of all our public servants, there are actually quite a few quite passionate libertarians. And in fact, I noticed that also when I was involved in another political party, that Canberra did have quite sort of, right-leaning people in their party down there. Because I think if you're going to go out of your way to join a political party and you live in Canberra, then you probably feel pretty committed about it, I would think. Yeah,
because you sort of stand out like a sore thumb. And talking about small government in the town where over 50% of people work for the government, and half of those moved here just for the job. So, and then he's saying, I want you to lose your job. Yes.
Won't make you any friends at public bar, that's for sure. Guy, you've only just been announced tonight, so I assume you don't have your social media up, but for those watching, I'm sure you'll have something for them to follow your campaign soon, maybe Facebook or Twitter. Have you given that much thought? Or?
Yeah, I was talking yesterday with the president in ACT that yes, should actually start up a Facebook page.
Fantastic.
So I'll have to learn all the tricks of the trade there and how that works.
Well, welcome to the Senate Club, Guy. Great to have someone from ACT, and Topher next week for those asking. So thank you, Guy. I'd ask you to stay in the chat. There's a few people asking you questions already, so thank you for joining us. Now, we have two other candidates to introduce you to tonight from New South Wales. So JR, you've hijacked the show, I see, with your stellar candidates. We have Sonia Bailey, who is running in the electorate of Paterson, and Liza Tazewell, who is running in the electorate of Parramatta. Now, ladies, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Now, Parramatta was really heavily hit by the lockdowns. Liza, is that why you're running, or can you tell us what's motivated you to run for the Liberal Democrats?
And actually, if I start a little bit further back, like I've been really I was actually born around here, but I've been really fortunate. I've had a career that's expanded where I was 16 years overseas. So 16 years in the, 8 years in the UK, then 8 years in Asia. And while I was living in Asia, I was there when there was the Hong Kong protests and the CCP were coming in. And so it was really quite alarming. And the other thing that I was also doing, I was actually working for an Australian investment bank, and I actually used to head up risk. And as a part of my risk role, I actually looked after things like financial crimes and surveillance. And I remember when the social credit was coming through in China and watching it from a surveillance perspective going, oh my God, this is really scary. And between that and the protests, I thought, you know what, I'm going home. Like, I'm going to take my family home, and we're going back to Sydney. We're going back to like near Parramatta near my family. So you can imagine my horror when I was watching the Melbourne protests, and I could see the same thing that I had just left. And I could see all the legislation that had been happening and what was going through. And I thought, you know what, no more, this is enough. So that was actually what really encouraged me. I thought, you know what, for my future, for my family, this has to stop. So I reached out originally and, wanted to find out about the party. I did see John Ruddick on the protests. And when I saw him there, I was like, right, that's it. I've got to find out more about the Lib Dems. And so then I got involved, and I've been kind of on the peripherals for a while, and I've been thinking about standing as a candidate, but I've got a small business, and, I was busy with that. And, we'd been impacted with the lockdowns because the business that I have now, I left banking, is we do basically design and renovations. So I was working with a lot of tradespeople that had been really impacted through the lockdowns, to the point where police were going past houses with spotlights looking into houses to see that there wasn't people congregating. Like, that's outrageous. And so we were going through this, and I really felt that we were disproportionately impacted. And so I thought, you know what, this is really important to me. I'm really, really passionate about this, and I'm going to stand up. And it's been really quite surprising, the people that I've spoken with, I'll talk about, what are the things that they really care about. And surprisingly, the thing that's actually come out quite a lot is free speech. It's actually been something where people have said, we're sick and tired of not being able to say things that we actually, what we've seen, because a lot of people here have seen this in their home countries. And they feel like they're in a position now where they can't share it. And so for all these reasons, obviously it's the small businesses, the COVID lockdowns. For me, it's surveillance, coming from that kind of surveillance background and seeing what that looks like. So I've thrown my hat in the ring, and I'm really hoping that I can share a voice for people in Parramatta, born and raised here, and come back. So,
well, the good thing that's going in your favour out of Parramatta, besides everything else, like it was sort of the lockdown central and everything else, is the Labor Party didn't have any local party members.
I know.
Input. They've got some young whiz kid, corporate kid, who's got a $16 million house at Bellevue Hill, which is the glitziest part of the eastern suburbs. They've parachuted him in there. Now the Parramatta local Liberals, many of them are very, very good people. They've been prohibited by the Prime Minister from having a vote on who the candidate is.
Yeah.
They're pretty cranky. I've spoken to probably a dozen of them in the last month or so, Lisa. They all told me they're going to vote for you, the Liberal Democrat.
Yeah.
So
good.
Yes. So look, it's a good, and that seat, Ross Cameron, our good friend Ross Cameron, had a couple of terms, 3 terms, but it has been trending increasingly towards, like in the last 10 years, away from the Labor Party. I think the Labor Party used to take it for granted. It's about 53% Labor at the moment.
Yep.
Look, I think the western suburbs is the common sense capital of Sydney, and I think it will be a very interesting result.
No, I think so too. And and the messages of support that I've had, like especially with a lot of my tradie guys that I've been working with, and I've reached out and I was, and the message of sport has been really incredible. So I'm like, okay, fantastic. So I'm really excited, and I'm really excited to actually be a local voice, and yeah. So
Parramatta, a seat to watch in the federal election. Now
exactly.
we also have Sonia Bailey. Are you still there, running in the electorate of Paterson?
Yeah, sure.
Hi. Welcome to the show, Sonia. Can you tell us why you're running for the Liberal Democrats?
So I had spent quite a large portion of the last 2 years sitting and watching what was going on around our nation, and quite frankly disgusted in the manner that a lot of things have been handled, not just the COVID mandates, but the way that welfare has been handled, the way that super withdrawal was handled. There are so many things that I just saw going on that I really felt were just poorly managed. When I was stood down without pay from my job last year, when we went into lockdown, I contacted several local members of parliament, because where I live is actually on the junction between 3 electorates. I contacted all of them and could not get any answers. I wanted to know when I could go back to work. I wanted to know how I was going to pay my mortgage. I wanted to know how I was going to pay my kids' school fees and my petrol and my groceries and everything else when I had zero income and zero way of making an income, and they couldn't answer me. I didn't receive a response from a single member of parliament. So that is what then led me to have to do my own research, to have to learn about public health orders. I had to learn where to find them, how to read them, how they got updated, who was responsible for that. I actually found a mistake in the 14th Amendment of the first public health order. That then led me to have a connection in Canberra where public health orders were concerned, and that essentially birthed my passion for asking the tough questions, but also getting the actual answers and speaking the truth about it. A lot of people last year, they were confused. Where do we stand? When do we go back to work? What's happening next? The rules were changing on a weekly basis and people just couldn't keep up. It was exhausting. Then we've rolled over into this year, and all of a sudden, the boys in Canberra, they're slapping each other on the back. Everything's honky-dory and we can cut this tax and we'll roll out this amazing budget. I use that term quite loosely. But people seem to have forgotten what it is that we've been through in the last couple of years and where that came from. And as the gentleman mentioned earlier, in regard to the budget being released, where is this headed? It's all well and good to say, yay, we've got we're cutting the excise on the fuel that we just implemented over the last couple of months. Now we're the heroes. I don't think so, because beyond that, we're going to have interest rate increases. We're going to have cost of living increases. We have now a massive national debt that has to come from somewhere. So for me, the Lib Dem policies that I'm most passionate about is removing the COVID alarmism. Let's lift those mandates. Let people get back to work. I think we've reached that point where we can live with it now. If you want to wear a mask, wear a mask. You want to get the jab, get the jab. Whatever it is that you want to do to protect yourself, totally fine. But we should all be getting back to work. We should all be reopening businesses. We should all just be getting on with our lives. Following on from that, low tax rates and increasing the tax-free threshold. Imagine for a minute that if you were a low-income earner working part-time, if you earn up to $40,000, you don't have to pay tax on that. That's more money in your pocket. We need to be supporting our own nation to support themselves.
Well, that's fantastic, Sonia. Thank you. I would really love to see you in the lower house tearing some of them a new one. What do you think, JR? You've got a great team in New South Wales.
Well, look, I'm thrilled. I haven't actually spoken to Sonia, so Sonia, thank you. Welcome aboard very much. You sound fabulous. Now, your seat of Paterson, that is, just so people know, it's immediately north of Newcastle. Is that correct?
Correct. So it runs from Nelson Bay, Maitland, and just to the east side of Cessnock.
Okay. Now, what do you reckon if you go down on a Saturday morning and you walk around the main street of Maitland, which is a pretty big place, I'm guessing about 40,000, 50,000 people live there.
Yep.
how many people are wearing a mask on a Saturday morning in Maitland these days?
I would say probably 30 to 40%.
Okay, right. Well, that's a lot less than the city.
Yeah.
So that means there's more common. That has my anecdotal evidence, and I think, Campbell, you were saying it when we spoke on the phone a week or two ago. The anecdotal evidence is that people outside of the metropolitan areas have got more common sense about COVID.
Oh yeah, yeah. Look, I mean, I'm just thinking really hard just to be accurate here. Like, we visited 5 regional communities a week and a half ago, and I don't recall anybody wearing a mask at all at any time. So, yeah, and the Toowoomba on the weekend at the show, the Toowoomba show, and numbers were down, I'm afraid, but no, I think that was to do with people being a bit concerned about the vaccine mandate, actually, because they heard, if you're not double vaccinated, you can't come. And I think people thought that meant they couldn't bring unvaccinated kids. Different issue. But I only saw 1 or 2 masks the whole time I was at the Toowoomba show, and it's not a small affair. It's pretty big. There's many people there.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight, Liza and Sonia. As I said, New South Wales candidate for Paterson and Parramatta. Stay in the chat, please. There's lots of questions for you, everyone. You've fired everybody up this evening. It's great. So thank you for joining us.
One last little thing to Sonia. On the day after the launch in Sydney, on the 9th of April, on the 10th of April, Barry Reid, who is our candidate for the federal seat of Shortland, which is in Newcastle, is having an event there. So Sonia, it would be terrific to catch up with you there.
Yep.
If you've heard about that.
I have, yep.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, we'll look forward to meeting you then.
Thank you.
Thank you. And speaking of events, we have an event section on our website, ldp.org.au/events, if I'm correct. That has all the events in your states. Please have a look. Please come along. Western Australia will be at the Freedom Rally this Saturday at midday. We've got a speaking spot, so come down. And yes, it's all happening. We're full steam ahead into the federal election. Now, JR, I'm going to let you indulge in your hero, Ronald Reagan. I still have you saying that if you had a boy, you would call him Ronnie Ruddick in my head. So please indulge us with finishing off blistery history on Ronald Reagan.
Okay, so last time we got up to, he had become the governor of the great state of California, and he would often say, I'm not a conservative, I am a libertarian. This is in the 60s. Okay, he was always considered this conservative sort of warrior. But he said, look, I'm into small government. He said, I'm like Thomas Jefferson. And he was a very successful governor. And then he ran for president in 1968. Now, in 1968 is the year that Richard Nixon became the president. But in the primary, Ronald Reagan sort of shocked by saying, people didn't expect him to run for governor. For president. And he came 3rd in that primary. And he sort of locked in he was sort of the man who was on the make in the Republican Party by becoming a surprisingly strong 3rd. Now then Nixon wins, gets re-elected in 72, resigns in 74. Gerald Ford, his vice president, becomes the president. And then Gerald Ford is up for re-election in 1976. Now it's very unusual for a sitting president to be challenged in the primary. And Ronald Reagan did challenge Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford was this big. Here we have it. Now, then what happened is Gerald Ford was pretty underwhelming type of a guy. Ronald Reagan was this incoming sort of hero, and he almost defeated an incumbent president. And then Gerald Ford, in fact, offered Reagan the vice presidency. Reagan said, "Thank you, Mr. President, but I'm not a vice president. I'm a president." Gerald Ford loses. Ronald Reagan runs for the presidency in 1980, wins the Republican nomination. Now, all of his detractors were saying he's a warmonger, he's going to bring about a nuclear war, he's an extremist, he's an anti-communist extremist. And Reagan was not looking good against Jimmy Carter. And this is when they had one televised presidential debate. The polls, and this is only about a week before the election, the polls were very, very close. And it was sort of, if anything, leading in Jimmy Carter's favour. But then when they had this debate, and it went for an hour, and the average American saw how much of a nice guy Ronald Reagan is, because he is just the quintessential nice guy, besides everything else, his other positive qualities. he ended up winning massively against Jimmy Carter. Okay, so he gets in. About a month later, some nutcase shoots him. Okay, he would have been about the fourth president shot, and thankfully the bullet just missed, or it hit him, but not fatally. Reagan brings in the tax cutting agenda. He teamed up with his best friend, his best political friend, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher had been in for a year before. The two of them brought in economic reform, okay, magnificent economic reform, which was cutting taxes, cutting regulation, just culturally championing free enterprise. Now, one thing Reagan was not able to do was cut spending, because he did as the governor of California, and he desperately wanted to cut spending. But what happened was he never had Republicans in control of the Congress. And so the deficit did balloon under Reagan. But in the 1990s, when the Reagan Republicans under Newt Gingrich got control of the Congress, then they really did cut spending and fixed up the budget. Now, what the greatest achievement of Reagan, of course, was after they all said that he's going to start a nuclear war, he ended up becoming very good friends with the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And in fact, the first three, when Reagan became the president, there was these really old guys. There was at least two, maybe three, Brezhnev and Andropov, and I think there was another one there. And they were like in their 80s. And Reagan did, to intimidate the Soviets, he did triple spending on defense. Okay, and he said, look, because the defense had been wearing, and this freaked the Soviets out. But thankfully, they reacted by putting up a moderate, or sort of somebody who was into openness, called Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, when they had the first summit in 1985 in Geneva, Reagan and Gorbachev had never met, and they've got all their aides, and they're sitting around a table, and they're having their big official meeting between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then what happened was Reagan just says to Gorbachev at the very beginning, he says, look, why don't just you and I, and you bring one interpreter, I'll bring another interpreter, we'll just walk down to the lake and have a talk by ourselves and get to know each other. They ended up spending about 3 hours together, and they ended up becoming very, very much liking each other. And that was really the beginning of the Soviet Union, where they started opening things up. And it was because of Reagan's pressure. Now, I think from a libertarian point of view, Reagan's greatest moment was when the stock market crashed in 1987. Now, this was the most dramatic stock market crash, because it was like the Dow Jones fell about 23% overnight, which is far bigger than the GFC, far bigger in terms of one night than what happened in 1929. Now, what happened in 1987 with Reagan and Thatcher at the helm and the stock market crashes? Everyone said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? You've got to do something. Reagan said, we're going to do nothing. We're going to let the market find its natural bottom. Some businesses will go broke, and we're just going to let the market recover naturally. Now, this is the opposite of what they did in 1929, and all those remedies gave us the Great Depression, and the opposite of what they did in 2008 with the subprime crisis, where they said, people like Obama and Herbert Hoover said, "Oh, we're going to spend money. We got to do something. Reagan said, "I'm just going to sit back and let it happen." Then that we got out of that stock market. It turned out to be a little blip in history, that stock market crash, and we had a minor recession afterwards, not a big deal. That was and that took guts for what Reagan did there. Okay, now then, look, I think Reagan in 1984, how long have I got, Kate? Well, I think we're pretty much wrapping up, aren't I, at 8:24? Have I got one more minute?
You've got one more minute.
Okay. Reagan's last public act was, and look, I think one of his greatest speeches was his farewell address, which you can see on YouTube, Ronald Reagan farewell address. I encourage you to watch that. It's a beautiful speech. But 6 years after that, Ronald Reagan announced to the world that he had Alzheimer's, and it was really his last public statement. He lived for about another 8 years after that. But when he announced he had Alzheimer's, he wrote this beautiful letter to the American people. It was like his farewell address in writing. And it was 3 days before the congressional elections in 1994, which is when the Newt Gingrich Republicans very strongly took over both houses of Congress for the first time in 50 years. And the big swing, a big part of it was Reagan's address, and a really heart-rending, heartwarming address from Reagan. And look, what those Republicans did in the 1990s was very, very good. And President Clinton, they basically fulfilled what Reagan had been championing in the 1980s. So there it is, Kate. Ronald Reagan forever.
Thank you, JR, and thank you, because I just had major technical difficulties. So you actually saved me there with your passion for Ronald Reagan. Now,
very good.
Tonight is our last Freedom Manifesto video. For those of you just joining us for the first time, these are videos based on our 10 policies to save Australia. It's a policy document that all your candidates are pledged allegiance to for the purposes of this election. Tonight, we have our video on surveillance.
Did you know that your personal social media account can be taken over by the government without your knowledge, and the government can use your account to chat with all your contacts, go through your entire history, and even post things as you? Hi, I'm Paul Barker, and I'm running as the Liberal Democrats candidate for Corangamite. In this video, I want to talk to you about the 10th policy in the Liberal Democrats' Freedom Manifesto: freedom from surveillance. The Liberal Democrats aim to protect your data and your voice online. The government's mass surveillance laws enable warrantless access to data, grant the government access to the private networks of organisations, and enable government to take over the online accounts of Australians. The Liberal Democrats will reverse all this. Included in our policy is the following: no digital identity laws, abolish mass surveillance laws, stop government hacking and seizure. We require warrants for targeted surveillance of individual Australians. Stop attacks on encryption. We will focus government on improving its own cybersecurity. The government regularly fails its own cybersecurity audits. Improvement is required to avoid foreign governments compromising Australian government systems. We will free Julian Assange. Assange alerted the world to the dangerous power of the state in the age of the internet at a great personal cost. We will advocate for his release and repatriation. Mass surveillance laws concentrate far too much power in the hands of the government. The Liberal Democrats will roll back the surveillance and protect your freedoms online.
Authorised by John Humphreys for the Liberal Democratic Party, Mount Waverley, Victoria.
That video is now live on our YouTube channel, so please Google Liberal Democrats Australia. It's there for you to like and share. Gentlemen, surveillance. I know, David, in Victoria, this is probably a hot button issue for you.
Yes. Actually, mass government surveillance was one of the things that I've always been concerned about, even back when I wasn't a libertarian, back when I was a lefty. I was still concerned about all this, and I'm more concerned about it now than ever, really. So, I think this is a great policy. Anyone that's been following me in Victoria will know that I've been advocating strongly for the government to speak up and do something about Julian Assange. We've been very concerned about some of the mass surveillance that's been happening during COVID, and pre-COVID. We've had a really big bill that we fought, and we were really upset about that. It didn't get a lot of traction, but the government removed judicial oversight for forcible DNA collection via police. And that's like a new step towards the government being able to, the police being able to collect DNA in Victoria, which we were very upset about. And I'm hoping that, now that more people are concerned about this sort of stuff, that they'll notice when these sort of battles come along and they'll fight with us.
In Western Australia, we still have the mandatory sign-in app, Safe WA, and we're campaigning on a scrap the app message at the election. We don't need the government tracing and tracking where we've been. Campbell, Newman, thoughts on the surveillance policy?
Can't hear you, Cam.
No, Cam was having...
Yeah, got it. Sorry. I've got
the government was hacking into you.
I've got another moot switch. Sorry, I'll start again. As someone who's been inside government, local government, and then obviously as Premier, I can just assure people that the sad fact is that bureaucrats and indeed police are always after more and more power. And what we've seen with the war on terror And then the last 2 or 3 years, with again more sort of amping up of threats from overseas, these sort of draconian laws. And I know, I've previously talked about the bikies in Queensland, but I assure people that, and I've answered those sort of questions, but I really assure people that this stuff has to be opposed, and I oppose it 100%, because it's as David said, it's these sort of powers without, particularly without having to go before an actual judge, that are the most scary aspects, because people on the AAT are political hacks. When the AAT is just stacked with people who are ex-politicians or people who are strong supporters of political parties. They are not the right people to assess these sort of requests from intelligence agencies. And I do question fundamentally whether the intelligence agencies needed the power in the first place.
JR, any final comments before we wrap it up for the evening?
Just last week, with barely any attention, the government announced that they're bringing in this law. The IPA made a bit of noise about it, but they and I think Labor's going to back it, where they're going to bring in this. The regulator is going to have the power over misinformation on the internet and disinformation, and they're going to be able to stamp it out. Now, this is worse than anything this government has done. This is worse than the debt. This is worse than COVID mania. This is worse than the capitulation on zero carbon. Because these policies can all be addressed. But if they're going to bring in this 1984 police state, this Orwellian state, where they can control we really should be focusing on that issue. I think it would freak people out a lot. It certainly freaked me out.
It's government-defined truth.
Yes, it's shocking, And they brought it out in the middle of the Ukraine going crazy and just before the budget and hardly got any attention. Well, we need to let people know about it.
Well, that's it for tonight, everyone. It's so good to be back. Thank you for joining us. A lot of great comments in the chat. Thank you for letting me be your host. I hope you enjoyed the show. We do have a federal election around the corner. It might be called this weekend. Now is the time to get involved, to donate, to go to an event and speak to your candidates and see how you can help them, because every little bit counts. We are a minor party. The David and Goliath battle is ahead of us. So please, anything you can do to help your party, the Liberal Democrats, get elected, have these voices that we've heard tonight in the Parliament. Please, anything you can do to help is extremely appreciated in our party. So thanks for joining us. Thank you to my fellow Lead Senate candidates. I look forward to meeting most of you in the coming weeks for our big events.
You're a fabulous host, Kate.
You've been a great host, yes.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for Liberty Chat, brought to you by the Liberal Democrats. Visit ldp.org.au for more info.